ever since I've started DMing on a regular basis, especially once I started doing podcasts and a YouTube channel and streaming on Twitch. I've gotten a pretty consistent question over the years regarding how to plan out and engage in a campaign without railroading. Questions like, my party's gotten way off track, how do I get them back into focus on the campaign, various things like that. And the strategy that I use is something that I tend to call moving the goalposts, which we're going to talk about today. Welcome back to the Gate Pantheon. I am Eric, and today we're going to talk about kind of campaign planning, but more importantly, running a campaign. How to plan out a campaign in such a way that isn't restrictive to the players, but can still be respectful of your time and creativity as a dungeon master. Because that's a tough thing to balance. You don't want to restrict the players and put them on tracks and don't allow them to make any choices on their own. But at the same time, it's unreasonable to expect you as a dungeon master to improv everything 100% of the time because you're letting the players do anything and everything they want to do. And also, it's hard to tell a cohesive story that way as a table. It's difficult when you don't know from moment to moment what you need to be throwing as obstacles in front of the players because they have all this freedom and this agency. So we're going to talk about moving the goalposts, how to plan a campaign out that way, and why I think it's a good idea. So the first point that I want to make is keep your planning modular. So what I mean by that is when you're in the planning phase of your campaign, you're thinking about what you want to have happen and the obstacles that the party's going to be facing and the overarching narrative that you're hoping to put in front of the players, to put on the table. It is very easy to, as a dungeon master, to overplan at this phase and think about exactly who the villain is and who their minions are and what organization they belong to and yada, yada, yada. And that can be dangerous. Being perfectly honest, it can be something that puts you in a box and therefore puts the players in a box of saying, well, I've established that the villain of the story is an evil magistrate in Baldur's Gate, and the party wants to go to Waterdeep, but the villain's in Baldur's Gate, so that's not going to work. So how am I going to figure this out? And what I mean by modular planning is establish that it's a corrupt magistrate, establish what they want, why they're a corrupt magistrate, so on and so forth, what type of organization they run, who the big players in it are, who really hates this corrupt magistrate as potential allies for the party, but build it as a skeleton. Don't say an evil magistrate in Baldur's Gate, just say an evil magistrate. And if the party really likes Waterdeep and is like, let's go to Waterdeep, it's going to be a lot of fun, we can do this and this and this, then that's where the evil magistrate can live. And because you've kept the planning of the overall organization pretty nebulous as well, you can then take figures from Waterdeep and put them in the organization and make it tied in that way, as opposed to being stuck in a situation where like, well, I can't do what I wanted to do now because it was all planned around Baldur's Gate. So keep your planning modular, and the more modular you keep it, the less you have to get rid of things that you really enjoyed planning out. Because obviously, even if you put all the heavy work into planning out this Baldur's Gate campaign, you could always file the serial numbers off and move it over to Waterdeep, but that's a lot of work, and you're going to be less willing to do that because you put in so much work towards this really cool villain in Baldur's Gate. So yeah, I would keep the planning as modular as possible. Avoid names, locations, things like that in the planning stage. The next part is something that I kind of touched on a little bit, but I really want to dig deep into it. Establish the goals for the entities that you're planning, whether it's your villain, their lieutenants, potential allies for the party, mentors for party members, things like that. You want to establish what their goals and motivations are. Once again, that can still be modular in nature. You're not saying they want to ascend to the rank of X in organization Y in city Z. You're not doing that. You're just saying they seek power. They want to ascend to a higher rank than they currently have. Or they want to protect people of this oppressed class. They really want to help these types of people, things like that, and keep it nebulous. That way you can put it in anywhere in your game world, depending on what draws the eye of the party. But as long as you establish these motivations and these relationships and this history amongst the pieces that you're going to be playing with as a dungeon master, that gives you a lot to work with. It's such an underrated part of it, of coming up with what motivates your villains beyond just the generic, like, what is the plot stating that they want, but what do they want and why do they want it? Because that's going to give you so much real estate when it comes to moving things around and keeping the pieces moving and keeping things rolling. So definitely do that. Come up, treat it like a character, treat it like a light player character, where establish a backstory, establish why they want what they want and what they're willing to do to get it. And then you will know so much about these characters, and it will lead into the next point that's really good and vital for this type of campaign planning and running a campaign this way. But before we get into that, if you're enjoying the video, please give it a like down below and subscribe to the channel. It does help out a whole heck of a lot. And if you want to talk about this stuff in real time, I do stream on Twitch every Sunday and Tuesday at 8 p.m. Central and Saturdays at 8 a.m. as well. Come by, hang out. I would love to have you. For the next point, what we're going to be talking about, though, is use the pieces that you have in play in order to make the story feel organic and logical. And so what I mean by that, and this goes for the entirety of your campaign. This isn't just at the beginning when you're starting things off. At any given point in the campaign, your story from session 1 begins to establish a kind of internal lore, as it were. And by establishing this, what you can then do is play off of that lore to get the players to feel really invested and to make your story feel truly organic in nature, because the party has their internal relationships, but they also have relationships with external forces and with the villain and the villain's lieutenants and their allies and all that kind of stuff. And if you use that knowledge that you have to really move these pieces around in a way that the players will feel invested in, it will feel so much more organic and logical. Because I think where a lot of campaigns tend to fall apart from a storytelling standpoint is when events happen or decisions are made by NPCs in an illogical manner that does not fit within the internal logic of the story being told. I've had that moment at tables where I've had the villain or just an NPC in general do something that just didn't make sense logically, but it's what the adventure mandated that I do. Even if I was the one writing it, it's like, well, this has to happen for the story to continue. And if you've ever hit that point, you've got to take a step back and think, okay, either what is the logical thing that would happen here? What would actually happen? Why does this feel illogical? Or how do I make the thing that needs to happen for the adventure to continue? How do I make that logical? Whether it's how do I bump up the stakes for the players to where it makes sense that they would go and do this thing, or how do I use the narrative that's being told about this NPC to make it make sense that they would present this option or need this thing from the party? Because those are typically the two things that stories tend to fall apart on at a table. Is either it makes no sense that the players would agree to do this thing. They can see that it's a bad guy offering them the job, and it's like, why would we ever do this? Well, it's because we want to play D&D, and this is clearly where the session needs to go. Or why'd the NPC do that? Like, that was so dumb, or that didn't make any sense, or anything like that. And so as long as you can take a step back from those moments and then adjust to where it does make internal sense. You don't need to spell it out for the players. That's not what I'm saying. But as long as it makes internal sense in the way that you know it does, and down the road, maybe the players will put the piece together and go, oh, it makes so much sense why they did that thing now. Ah, crap. But you know the difference between an illogical decision being made within a story that's just forcing a plot point that's been established levels, sessions, years before, and just forcing that square peg into a circle hole. You know the difference between that and a decision that it makes logical sense once everybody has all the information, and you always have all the information, so it should make sense to you. So if a decision doesn't make sense to you as the dungeon master, it's time to reevaluate. And one last thing real quick before we get into the final point of this video. If you want to support the channel in any way, we do have a Patreon, patreon.com/thegeekpantheon, or a Ko-fi, ko-fi.com/thegeekpantheon. Both of those are two options where you can support the channel, help us continue to grow. All the lighting, the camera, all this stuff was because of our wonderful patrons. And so if you want to support the channel, we would love to have you over there. Okay, and the last thing, don't be afraid to slap on a new paint job and allow the story to continue in a new setting. And I know this is kind of coming full circle with the Waterdeep Baldur's Gate stuff. But what I mean by that is just because the story doesn't kick off the way that you expected it to, or Act 2 doesn't kick off the way you expected it to, or the final encounter isn't happening the way you, anything can have this done. There's a great story from one of the first podcasts I ever got really into, the Order 66 podcast, which is all about the Star Wars role-playing game system from Fantasy Flight Games, where I stole the obligation mechanic from in that other video. Link up there, and link to Order 66 down there. But there was a story being told by one of the hosts, GM Phil, talking about how he was playing in a World of Darkness game where the GM just wasn't communicating effectively the campaign, essentially, like what the party was meant to be doing. And so they were just like, I guess we're gonna go to a bar and beat up some werewolves, because they were vampires. And they beat up the werewolves, they continued just putter around the city, and eventually the big bad evil won because the party never engaged in the story and they just executed their plans. And that's how the campaign ended. And GM Chris, one of the other hosts who I am inclined to agree with here, said, well, what should have happened, and granted, hindsight is 2020, but as a GM, what should have happened there is you go to the bar, you fight these werewolves, and those werewolves are now the kicking off point for the story. Whatever you had planned as the kicking off point for the story, punt that, it's done, it's not going to happen, and shift your focus to this new thing that's happened. And say, oh, well, they had a cryptic note on them, or you just disrupted a drop, or any number of things you could do in that situation to get a campaign to kick off from a random fight with some werewolves. So that's a great example of this kind of notion. Another good example is from my own experience as a Dungeon Master with Eberron Renewed, the first campaign of the actual play podcast that I do, where I had planned out a lot of stuff in the Eberron setting with the nation of Dargoon, and I knew the party was going to go there for Act 2 of the campaign, and I knew that I had all this stuff planned out in different factions and different artifacts and yada yada yada. And they went to Stormreach. They went down to Zendrick, a totally different continent. And I basically had the option of just taking all the stuff I had planned out for Dargoon and tearing it up and throwing it away, or slapping on a new coat of paint, and all the stuff that was like mountainous terrain and kind of deserty and barren wasteland is now a jungle. And that's where all this stuff is going to take place. So yeah, that's what I'm talking about here, is if you afford your party and your players the agency to make these kind of decisions and go the places that they want to go that make logical sense for them, because without getting into too much of a spoiler territory for Eberron Renewed, the party was on the run at this point. They needed to get out of Dodge, and the party decided the more logical choice was to go to a different continent completely, away from what they were on the run from, so that they could gain their bearings and figure out what move to do next. Makes total sense. Totally logical, going back to the previous point. And if I would have concocted some reason why they couldn't, that wouldn't have played right within the internal logic of the story. Why not? Why couldn't they? And so yeah, that's what I'm talking about, is being flexible in that way, of being willing to take elements of your story and put them in front of the party. Like we said at the beginning of this video, move the goalposts. You know what the win conditions are for the campaign. You're in control of them. You can change them. You can move the goalposts. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up down below. Subscribe to the channel. It does help out a whole heck of a lot. And let me know what you thought. What else would you like me to talk about as a dungeon master? What other lessons that I've learned over the years would you like me to share with you? Let me know down in the comments below. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you next time.